The year was 1904. Missouri stood at the crossroads of a changing America. St. Louis was about to welcome the world with the Grand Exposition, an event that promised to showcase progress, innovation, and prosperity. But only a few miles away from the bustling lights and the hopeful crowds, an entirely different story was unfolding. A story so unsettling, so grotesque, that it would be silenced, erased from official records, and whispered only in fragments, if at all. This was the story of the Whitaker family. The Whitakers lived in rural Missouri, on a patch of land that seemed forever cloaked in a kind of unease. Neighbors spoke of strange sounds that carried from their home at night, the echo of cries that didn't match the rhythm of conversation, the choking laughter of children who never seemed to age, or so it was claimed. Farmers riding past their property often urged their horses into a brisk trot, eager not to catch sight of the figures who haunted the porch at dusk. But what made the Whitakers infamous wasn't just rumor. It was what was found. The first public mention came in December of that year. A drifter passing through town, ragged and tired, found himself at the sheriff's office after claiming he had seen a cursed family, malformed and twisted by some evil hand of God. He spoke of hollowed eyes that reflected no light, deformities that seemed too extreme to belong to man, and an atmosphere so heavy it made the air unbreathable. The sheriff dismissed him, as did most of the town. Misery had a way of exaggerating stories, after all, but 3 weeks later, when deputies were sent to the Whitaker land to investigate a missing herd of cattle, they stumbled onto something the town would never forget. The animals' carcasses were scattered, but what drew their gaze wasn't just the slaughter. It was the way the bones had been arranged, as though placed in deliberate patterns, spiraled into symbols no one could recognize. At the edge of that circle stood the Whitaker children. What the deputies described, their words trembling as if afraid of shaping the truth, was a sight so grotesque that most of their testimony was stricken from the official files. The local press never published the full account. Instead, whispers bled into oral history, and in time, those whispers warned of a family marked by something beyond comprehension, not by spirits or folklore, but by generations of decay, isolation, and horror too profound for polite society to acknowledge. The Whitakers weren't the only family living in seclusion in those rural woods. But others, though poor, though struggling against the harshness of nature, kept some trace of dignity, some tree of kinship with the world outside. The Whitakers, however, had withdrawn into something else, something darker. Their bloodline had folded in on itself, bending generation by generation, and what walked among them was a reflection of that hidden path. Faces sunken, eyes set too wide, mouths curved oddly downward, bodies twisted in impossible ways. Some locals called it a curse. Others called it God's punishment. Yet in silence, in the shadows of taverns or behind closed doors, the more honest admitted it was something worse, a truth too shameful to be catalogued in textbooks, too raw for historians to admit. The Whitakers, they said, were proof that humanity, left unchecked and isolated, could erode itself into something unrecognizable. And yet, the deeper truth of their story wasn't shared among neighbors, nor printed in newspapers. It was buried. Because to look too closely at the Whitakers meant staring into a mirror, one that reflected not just them, but the capacity of every family, every community, to destroy itself. This was why their name was erased, why official archives omitted them, because the Whitakers were never just a family. They were a reminder, and reminders of that kind are dangerous. But in 1904, before their story disappeared, one chain of events forced the world to look directly at the Whitakers, at least for a brief, shuddering moment. It began with the discovery of a body. At the edge of town, near the railroad tracks, a boy no older than 12 was found lying in the mud. The coroner noted that he had been dead for days, yet there were no clear wounds, no trace of struggle, only strange lacerations along the jawline, as though something had chewed, deliberately, yet carefully. More disturbing than his injuries was what he was holding in his left hand. A small wooden carving, crude but unmistakable. It bore the face of a Whitaker. By the following week, the whispers grew louder. People said the family had gone too far this time, that whatever curse ran through their blood had crossed into something no community could tolerate. The sheriff, pressured by townsfolk and brutal with fear himself, organized a search party to finally confront the Whitakers. What they would find inside that farmhouse would linger in Missouri's nightmares for decades, and this is where the macabre tale truly begins. On a cold January morning of 1904, the sheriff gathered 7 men. They were not soldiers, nor trained investigators, but ordinary townsfolk burdened with an extraordinary fear. A pair of farmers, a blacksmith, a miller's son, and 1 preacher, stood alongside 2 deputies, all bound by a silence that carried the weight of dread. None dared admit aloud that they wished someone else had been chosen in their place. Their destination was a lonely homestead, stretched over acres of forest and barren soil, the Whitaker property. The ride took nearly an hour from the town's edge, and for much of the way, no one spoke. The only sounds were the horses' hooves striking the frozen dirt, and the sharp breaths clouding the morning air. The men tried to keep their thoughts fixed on duty, yet every clop of hoof, every creak of saddle, recalled stories they had heard since boyhood. Stories of strange movements at the Whitaker place, of broken figures glimpsed at dusk, of children who never spoke to outsiders and never quite smiled. Some swore they had seen shapes at the windows, silhouettes that didn't align with natural posture. One farmer muttered a phrase he'd heard in his father's time, calling the Whitakers a family that ate itself from the inside. The sheriff hushed them and pressed on. His face showed the weight of leadership, but those nearest could see the tremor in his gloved hands. By the time the Whitaker house came into view, the men felt as though they had already entered another world, some place severed from Missouri's plains and farms. The building itself slouched against the land, timber sagging, windows black and unreflective, as if light itself refused to enter. Its chimney dripped a thin coil of smoke, too faint to promise warmth, more like breath struggling in a dying body. The stench reached them next. It rolled over the group before they had even tied off their horses. A putrid animal odor, layered with something sharper. Urine baked into rotted wood, old blood left hidden. The blacksmith spat and muttered that no house of God-fearing folk should smell this way. Yet no amount of spit, no curse or prayer could chase that suffocating odor from the men's throats. Then on the front porch, they saw her. An old woman sat in a wooden rocking chair. Agnes Whitaker. Her presence shocked them, not because she was alive, but because she resembled something not quite so. Her skin, pale and stretched tight, seemed almost like parchment over bone. Cataract-clouded eyes tracked their every movement, her head unmoving, her jaw slack. Her lips moved as if trying to form words, but the only sound she gave was a rasp, a dry hiss that rattled in her throat. And still, her chair rocked, steady, at first gentle, then in sharp mechanical jolts. They saw now her twisted foot, nudging rhythm against the porch, an almost maddening sound in the cold, dead air. The sheriff braced himself and called her by name, his voice cracking despite his authority. "Agnes, we need answers about the boy." He froze, waiting for acknowledgement. Nothing. Her withered face stretched in what might have been mockery or just a spasm, and the men shifted on their boots, each aware they were being seen, even if not understood. One of the deputies whispered, "She ain't gone. She's listening. She just won't talk." The sheriff hesitated, then mounted the steps. The boards groaned under his weight. He nodded, and the others followed him into the house. At once the world changed. The interior air was heavier than anything outside, an atmosphere thick with rot, trapped smoke, and the sour musk of decay. It burned the nostrils, clawed at the throat. Men who had slaughtered hogs without blinking found themselves gagging at a stench far worse, a smell that carried not just death but neglect, abandonment and sickness left unchecked. The house, rather than being organized into rooms, felt more like a nest of refuse. Furniture was scarce, overtaken by debris. Broken pots and shards of glass lay mixed with discarded cloth too filthy to read its original color. And then came the carvings, those strange, crude wooden faces. They were everywhere, lining shelves stuffed into corners, some even stacked in pyramids on the floor. Their features drooped, eyes too wide, mouths slashed open. None matched real proportion. It was as though whoever made them hadn't studied people, but distorted memories of people. Grotesque imitations trapped in wood. A farmer picked one up. It felt damp in his hands, slick with some unidentifiable residue. He dropped it instantly, cursing, his voice too loud in that heavy silence. Almost on cue, a new sound began, muffled at first, a low keening like an animal nursing a wound stretched into rhythmic moans. The men, frozen with a mix of fear and fascination, followed the noise. Their boots pressed down through layers of filth, every step stirring insects from long-neglected corners. They reached a scabbed-over hallway, where rot peeled away the walls. At the end, half hidden behind a warped frame, was a narrow bedroom door. The sheriff braced himself, lifted his lantern, and shoved it open. Inside, the breath left their bodies. 4 children, or what resembled children. Their limbs were crooked, uneven, torsos swollen in some places and wasted in others, skin blotched with sores, lips parted to reveal teeth growing sharper and at angles that cut into their gums. One crouched low, scratching furiously at mold on the floorboards. A girl gnawed at the carcass of a raccoon, her small face smeared in gore. Another rocked in trembling spasms, eyes darting uncontrollably. The fourth, taller, more aware, stood upright, swaying gently, mimicking the sheriff's posture. Its face glowed pale in the lantern light, and when it smiled, it revealed something no man could ever unsee. The preacher grabbed a crucifix from his pocket, hand quaking as he pressed it to his chest. Whispers rose, frantic, each man muttering disbelief, questions, prayers. Yet no one dared step forward, not even to pull the girl away from the torn animal. And then sound again. This time from above, a dragging rhythm, thuds against the floorboards upstairs. Heavy, uneven, as though each step cost the walker immense pain, yet carried unstoppable force. The ceiling creaked. Dust floated down in small clouds. All 4 children snapped their distorted heads upward. Their twisted features tightened into expressions the men could not name. Not terror, not hope, but something disturbingly close to anticipation. Whatever lived upstairs was coming. The deputies raised their guns as the preacher hissed, "Don't, for the love of God, don't fire." His voice choked, and one farmer whispered, "But what in God's name is it?" The answer was already descending. One step, another, dragging weight. The boards moaned like a voice trying to warn them. The air itself grew dense, as if the house braced against revelation. When the figure at last reached the landing of the staircase, the quiet men of Missouri would bear witness to something never to be recorded officially, something that would burn into their memories until their final breath, because the Whitaker family's secret was descending step by step to meet them, and it would not be a secret much longer. The silence inside the Whitaker house did not last. It fractured with every slow dragging step descending from the upstairs. Each thud echoed against the fragile timbers, a sound both labored and deliberate, swelling the dread of the men who stood frozen in the hallway. The lantern flame quivered with each vibration, casting distorted shadows across the warped walls and the twisted faces of the children below. The men dared not breathe too loudly. The preacher's hand shook against his crucifix, lips moving in unheard prayers. One of the deputies clenched his revolver so tightly that his knuckles blanched. The sheriff, doing everything he could to mask the tremor in his throat, lifted his lantern higher, pointing it toward the stairwell. What emerged was not sudden, nor explosive, but slow, as if the arrival itself obeyed a cruel ritual. First came a hand. Long, swollen knuckles bent in unnatural angles, nails yellowed and grown into curling points, more claws than fingernails. The hand dragged down the railing, scraping wood with each step, releasing a banshee-like screech that stabbed into every ear. And then the figure revealed itself. It was a man, or what had once been a man. His body was enormous, not in height alone, but in grotesque proportion, shoulders unnaturally wide yet sagging with wasted flesh, his ribs pushing the skin outward, while his frame drooped downward under its own distorted weight. His jaw jutted to one side, teeth overlapping in protruding, jagged chaos. His eyes were clouded yet open, their whites veined with a deep sickness. And when his lips parted, he exhaled not words but a wet, animal groan that filled the hallway. The Whitaker patriarch. Rumors had long said there was a man inside that house, too broken and misshapen to be seen in daylight. Now the men of Missouri saw him, and realization carried like lightning through every one of them. This was no curse placed upon a family, but something far more human and terrible. Years, perhaps generations, of bloodlines folding in on themselves, twisting the human form into a reflection almost unrecognizable. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, his bulk looming over the group. The 4 children stirred immediately. The girl dropped the raccoon carcass. The tallest of the warped sons began to sway more violently, his mismatched eyes focused entirely on the patriarch. They shifted toward him as though waiting for a signal, and the air in that hallway thickened with expectation. The sheriff, struggling for composure, forced his voice to rise. "Whitaker, you'll answer now. A boy is dead. Your kin, are they the cause?" It was a futile demand. The figure only stood there, groaning, half-swaying, his oversized jaw dripping saliva. Then came the sound none of the men would forget. It began as a chuckle, soft, barely audible, but it grew, rattling through the patriarch's twisted chest. Not quite laughter, but an attempt at it. Every malformed child in the room responded in kind, releasing sharp, fragmented cackles that fractured the silence like broken glass. The sound filled the house. One of the farmers broke. He raised his rifle, eyes wide in madness, and pointed it directly at the hulking form. The deputy shoved it downward just in time, the barrel clanking against the floor. No shots. "You'll kill us all if you do." The patriarch lurched forward. Not quick, not yet, but enough to press the men backwards. The children scurried like insects, their laughter escalating into ear-piercing shrieks. The smell of sweat, rot, and damp wood grew unbearable, suffocating the intruders, and then the preacher in desperation shouted scripture, his trembling voice reverberating desperately against walls that seemed to close in. Only then did something happen. The patriarch froze, eyes rolling in his skull, lips quivering as if trying to form words. For a split second, one fleeting second, there was silence. But what followed shattered even that fragile pause. From above, from the second floor, another sound emerged. Not steps this time, but the dragging scrape of something heavy across the boards. A slow, methodical heaving, as though another presence was being pulled or pulling itself closer to the stairwell. Lantern light flickered. The children silenced instantly, their shrieks replaced with an eerie, expectant stillness. The patriarch too stiffened, turning halfway toward the upstairs, his mouth twitching in anticipation. Whatever was coming from above was worse. The men realized it all at once. What they had seen, the old woman on the porch, the malformed children, even this monstrous father, was not the entirety of the Whitaker family. Something else remained upstairs. Something none of them were meant to see. The sheriff's jaw locked. His voice cracked when he ordered, "Back slowly, we leave now." No one moved at first, not out of defiance, but out of being chained in place by fear. The blacksmith managed to turn, his boots sliding slightly over the filth-strewn floor. He grabbed at the preacher, who still muttered his frantic prayers, and tugged him toward the door. The deputies lifted their revolvers again, but with their grips quivering. The weapons promised more danger to friend than enemy. And then, before escape could begin, the sound upstairs grew louder, heavier. Something was approaching the stairs, dragging itself inexorably closer. The floorboards above cracked and wailed, splinters falling like brittle rain into the hall below. A new smell invaded the air, acrid, metallic, like rust and wet iron mingled with spoiled meat. The patriarch's breathing deepened, ragged, almost excited. The children began to sway again, their eyes locked toward the top of the staircase. Every man in that hallway knew at that moment, whatever they had stumbled into was not merely a family's misery. It was something much worse. A pit dug across generations, a place where humanity itself had been disfigured into something feral, ritualistic, and unspeakable. Every instinct screamed at them to run, and yet none of them did because, for reasons they would never explain, every man present seemed compelled to see what would emerge from those stairs. And so they waited, lantern light trembling, hearts pounding, as the true heart of the Whitaker family revealed itself. The lantern flame shifted as the weight from upstairs drew nearer. Dust fell in soft clouds, clinging to the men's coats, forcing them to squint upward in dreadful expectation. The house groaned like a living creature under the strain, every board and nail protesting whatever pressed across the second floor. The sound was not footsteps now. It was dragging, a shuffle and pull, as though the very body that moved could not stand on its own. The sheriff forced his arm higher, lantern trembling, voice breaking with a command he himself did not believe. "Show yourself." The world seemed to pause in that instant until, slowly, the form emerged. It appeared on the landing above, a figure misshapen beyond reason, crawling with its arms, pulling swollen legs that refused to work. Its face, dear God, its face. The skull seemed too large for the neck that strained to hold it, forehead heavy and broad, chin pushed violently upward, as though shattered, reassembled wrong. Patches of hair clung like damp moss across its scalp. Its eyes bulged unfocused, whites veined crimson, and when it opened its mouth, the sound that erupted was not a human cry but an awful mixture of gurgle and wheeze that ran through every man's spine. The children below dropped to their knees, rocking, their mouths wide in matching groans that mirrored the stairborne figure. Even the patriarch bowed slightly, his gargantuan frame twitching with each groan, like a worshipper before his altar. The preacher finally broke. His cries of scripture transformed into wild shouts, words torn from his throat with desperation, as though raising the Lord's name louder could push back the vision before them. The blacksmith gripped his rifle again, body shuddering, his finger pulling dangerously tight against the trigger, and still the figure dragged itself lower. Every second of its descent was impossibly slow, deliberate. The scrape of bone against wood, the scraping of claws, because they looked less like fingers than claws, grinding the railing until splinters rained down. By the time it reached the fourth step, many of the men had tears cutting through the dust on their faces, though none would admit them later. Not tears of sadness, tears of raw fear, the body's only answer to a truth the mind refused to accept. The sheriff tried again, voice raised and cracking. "Whitaker! This ends now. You'll answer for what's been done." The creature slowed, staring directly at the lantern light. The air in the hallway turned weighted, suffocating. For a moment it seemed as though, through some grotesque miracle, it might understand. Its lips parted. A hiss of air seeped through warped teeth, and then came words, or something that wanted to be words. Broken syllables slurred together, mangled beyond clarity, spilling from its ruined mouth. A sound unlike any dialect known, yet deliberate, a failed attempt at human speech, trapped behind deformity so deep that thought itself had been strangled inside the bloodline. Those who heard it swore it wasn't language at all, but noise pretending at speech, a mockery of communication. The deputies stumbled backward, pistols half raised. One of them gagged openly, the other whispering, it ain't right, it should talk." And then the figure's chest convulsed. It released a piercing cry, drawn out until every candle in the room threatened to die from the vibration alone. The walls rattled. The children's groans turned into shrill, chaotic screams. The house became a cacophony of hell. That was the breaking point. The blacksmith fired. A thunderclap erupted in the hallway, smoke flooding instantly, choking the air. The shot slammed into the stairwell, tearing wood, perhaps grazing the figure itself, but not stopping it. Instead, the blast triggered something worse. The patriarch roared, a guttural sound, and surged forward. His massive arms swung, slamming into debris, tearing through piles of carvings. The children shrieked like feral creatures, scattering across the floor. The thing on the stairs heaved, faster this time, pulling itself down, not crawling anymore, but lunging. Chaos exploded. Men shoved against one another, desperate to retreat toward the door. The preacher fell to his knees, clutching his Bible, words spilling out faster than his mind could form them, calling to heaven as the rest fought to claw their way out of hell. Splinters burst as the stairs gave beneath the creature's weight, its colossal frame collapsing into the hall with a crash that shook the foundation. Dust and debris swallowed the men in a cloud, and for seconds that stretched into eternity, none could see clearly. Only shapes, grotesque, massive shapes, thrashing, screeching. The stench of blood and sickness rose thicker, choking, undeniable. When the smoke thinned enough, the sheriff could make out the outlines again, the patriarch looming, arms flailing. The stair-dweller writhing in fury, clawing forward. The children clinging to one another, swaying and howling like a ritual, their faces split with manic glee. The truth struck like lightning. This wasn't a family, they weren't individuals acting apart. They were one organism, bound in purpose, feeding off each other's grotesque spiral into ruin. The preacher, gasping on the floor, finally lifted his head. "This is no curse," he rasped. "This is creation gone foul." The sheriff grabbed him violently. "We move now." And with that, the men turned not to fight, but to survive. Their escape wasn't yet possible, for the Whitaker brood had surrounded them. The only question left was, who among them would cross that threshold back to daylight, and who would vanish within the house forever? The hallway had become a tomb. Gun smoke, dust, and the reek of decay clotted the air so thickly that men gagged as they stumbled in their panicked scramble. Lantern light flickered wildly, giving only flashes of what surrounded them, the patriarch's massive frame heaving and bellowing, the stair beast dragging itself across the floor in violent spasms, and the children weaving between them like carrion birds circling prey. The sheriff's order to move rang out, cracked and desperate. "Run! Out now!" His voice was nearly swallowed by the shrieks, groans, and unnatural pounding of the house shaking under the Whitakers' frenzy. The deputies fired wildly into the haze. Bullets tore into walls and shattered carvings, but the figures barely flinched. Splinters from freshly shattered wood rained down, mingling with the stench of powder and blood. One deputy tried to steady his aim, but a child leapt onto his back with feral agility, clawing at his face. He thrashed, screaming, his pistol discharging into the ceiling before he collapsed under the weight of the creature. By the time another man tried to drag him free, it was too late. The warped child's jaws had clamped over his throat. The blacksmith roared in terror, swinging his rifle not as a weapon to fire, but as a club. He smashed one of the carvings into shards that scattered like bones underfoot. He was nearly swallowed by the figures in the smoke, until the preacher, sobbing as he clutched his Bible, grabbed him by the shoulder and shrieked, "God isn't here." "Run!" Every man moved with no thought beyond survival. Boots slammed into the layered filth on the floor as they clawed toward the doorway. But the house itself seemed determined to keep them. Piles of broken things, of refuse and warped wood carvings, snagged at their legs. Every step was slowed, and the groaning presence behind them never ceased. The sheriff held his lantern high, leading the survivors through the room toward the porch. Its unsteady fire revealed the enormity of the patriarch now lurching after them. His gait was crooked, half-dragging, yet the force of his size was undeniable. With one swing of his arm, he toppled a shelf of carvings that cascaded across the floor like a wave of faces. In that jumble, one of the farmers stumbled and fell. He did not rise again. The stair-dweller lunged upon him, pulling him back into the smoke as though the house itself had claimed him. His scream was swallowed whole, leaving only the wet tearing of flesh and a single haunting echo. "Help me!" cut short in a choke of blood. The survivors tore into the front hall at last. Agnes Whitaker was still outside on her rocking chair, her cloudy eyes fixed on the door. She had not moved, had not twitched, as though the chaos within was some nightly ritual she had long witnessed in silence. The men burst past her, shoving into the cold air of the porch. For the first time, breath came sharp and painful, clean Missouri air after the stench of rot. But they couldn't stop. The shrieks followed, clawing after them through the halls, faster now, closer. The blacksmith turned to fire a final shot into the doorway, his hands shaking beyond control. The bullet whined through the frame. It did nothing. The preacher grabbed his arm and nearly dragged him, both stumbling down the porch steps into the frost-hardened soil below. The deputies and remaining farmer followed, the sheriff last, clutching the lantern with both hands, until his sweat made the glass slip. They ran. For the woods, for the path, for any semblance of distance from the hideous brood. But running from the Whitakers was not so simple. The children poured onto the porch after them, their shrieks carrying over the trees, echoing into the early night. They staggered and crawled with inhuman speed, driven not by order but by frenzy. One threw itself from the steps entirely, landing on hands and knees, snapping bones in the process but crawling forward regardless. The preacher stumbled as the thing lunged onto him. He shrieked, swatting at its warped hands, his crucifix flying from his grip into the dirt. The deputy nearest him shoved the child aside, fired point-blank into its chest, and watched it collapse into a twitching spasm. Blood poured black and thick, but the creature still writhed, still crawled toward them, closer and closer with every claw dragging through the mud. The sheriff screamed over the chaos, "Don't fight, keep running!" And so they pushed forward, each man with lungs raw from the night air. The blacksmith stumbled to one knee, catching himself with a curse, the tears already streaking his face not just from fear, but from the sight of what they had left behind. The screams of their companions still echoed behind them, the ones who had not escaped the hallway. Yet the Whitaker roars did not fade. The patriarch's voice bellowed from the porch, thunderous and feral. The stair beast's gurgles growled behind him, joined in cacophony with the wails of the spawn. The family stood outside, silhouetted by the doorway's glow. Those distorted shapes, those shadows, it wasn't pursuit. Not yet. It was a show of presence, a reminder to the men sprinting into the woods that they had not escaped. Not truly. Behind him, the sheriff turned back for one final glimpse. Agnes still sat in her chair, rocking slowly, eyes locked mercilessly on him through the dark. Her twisted foot nudged the chair as before, and for the first time her lips parted with audible words. Barely a whisper, but clear enough for him to hear. No one leaves whole. The rocking chair creaked steady. The woods pressed forward like a wall, and the survivors, dwindling, horrified, broken in body and mind, vanished into the timberline. But survival was not the same as escape, because the curse of the Whitakers had already marked them. When the survivors stumbled back into town that night, their faces told the story before their words even began. Coats torn, boots caked in filth, skin streaked with blood, not all of it their own. The blacksmith's hands still shook violently, unable to unclench from the rifle he refused to let go. The preacher's voice had broken into ragged sobs. His Bible clutched to his chest like a lifeline. The sheriff, pale and hollow-eyed, didn't dare meet the gaze of any townsfolk who gathered around them in silence. There had been 7 of them when they rode out. Now they were 5, and those 5 might never again know full sleep. At first the crowd pressed in with questions. What had they seen? What had they found? Was it bandits, murderers, witches? But the answers, when spoken aloud, fell apart in disorder and madness. The preacher raved about faces that God himself turned away from, his words tumbling into incoherent verses. The deputies spoke in broken flashes. Children, but not teeth too sharp, crawling like beasts. Their fragments carried terror enough to shake the room into murmurs. Then the sheriff raised his voice. It was hoarse, the sound of a man who had screamed too long before arriving. They're not right. That family. They're not people, not anymore. We can't go back there. We shouldn't. The blacksmith slammed his rifle on the table for emphasis, swearing he would burn the Whitakers alive if anyone dared gather a mob. His voice boomed with rage, but his trembling betrayed the truth. He wasn't calling for action. He was begging for protection. For hours into the night, arguments raged in the dim light of the sheriff's office. Some voices demanded justice, insisting the Whitakers had murdered the boy found at the tracks. Others, shaking their heads in disbelief, refused to accept what they were hearing. Whispers of madness grew, claims that the men who went there were drunk, delusional, or possessed by fever. It was easier to believe hysteria than corruption of that scale. The sheriff slammed his fist and silenced the room. You think I want to spread this? You think we're making this for tales? I saw it. We all saw it. Whatever's in that house, if there's a God left to care, it ain't his work. The room grew cold. The town knew the sheriff as a steady man, one who mocked foolish superstition. For him to say such words was worse than rumor. It was a warning. Still, silence followed, because no one wanted to hear the truth. In quiet corners of Missouri, generations had raised their children on whispered morality tales, but this was different. This wasn't a story from an elder to spook children away from the woods. This was nearby, this was flesh and blood, this was neighbors' land, and it was unbearable to confront. The mayor called for restraint, his voice trembling as much as his hands. We will not speak of this to the world. Not to St. Louis, not to the papers. We will settle this ourselves. The preacher howled at him, calling him a coward, insisting the world had to know what pressed against their borders. Yet the town hardened in the mayor's decision, not because they didn't believe, but because they couldn't afford to. With the coming exposition to put Missouri in the nation's eye, they would not allow their story to be one of deformity, horror, and corruption, and so silence became policy. The boy's death was marked as an accident, a fall by the railroad tracks. The 2 men who never returned from the Whitaker house were written off as victims of misfortune while investigating livestock theft, their true fate kept behind locked lips. The account given by survivors went no further than rumor, whispered only in drunken corners of saloons or when strangers came asking questions. The Whitakers remained in their crooked home, undisturbed, on land that suddenly no one in Missouri would walk near. Farmers skipped miles to avoid passing their woods. Hunters swore never again to run dogs into that stretch of timber. But silence does not heal. Silence rots. The survivors carried their visions in the marrow of their bones. The blacksmith grew volatile, drinking heavily and breaking into rages no one dared calm. The preacher abandoned his sermons, His voice splintered until the congregation found another man to replace him. The deputies resigned their posts within a year, unable to bear watching that house from a distance, living with the knowledge that something so foul went unchallenged. And the sheriff. He lived longest with it. He alone seemed determined to maintain a steady surface. But late at night, as his children would overhear, he woke screaming. He would insist that rocking sounds haunted his dreams, the sound of a woman's chair creaking steadily, endlessly outside a house of madness. It was easier for the rest of the town to erase it, to convince themselves that maybe there had been exaggeration. Maybe disease explained it. Maybe generations of isolation created what the men thought they saw. A community can survive horrors, but it cannot survive unrelenting truth. And thus the Whitakers became a secret Missouri prayed the world would never ask about. But the story did not end in silence. Because silence, as much as it conceals, also festers. Within a year, something emerged from the woods again, proof that whatever lived inside that house would not stay caged forever, and the town's choice to bury the truth would return to them like a debt. Spring arrived in Missouri with heavy rains that muddied the fields and swelled the rivers. The earth, freshly thawed, bloomed green again, yet in the town nearest the Whitaker place the season brought no relief. Silence had been agreed upon, silence as a shield, silence as survival. But silence is fragile. It fractures under weight. The first fracture came with livestock. Farmers near the edges of the Whitaker property began losing cattle in strange ways. A calf was found mutilated on the banks of a creek, its flesh stripped with a precision no wolf could manage. Chickens disappeared by the dozens, coops left splintered, feathers scattered in patterns too cleanly circular to be a fox, and yet no predator prints marked the mud, only long drag-like grooves as though heavy bodies had been pulled on hands and knees. Men grumbled but held their tongues. They muttered that beasts had grown bold in spring, or that desperate vagrants had taken to raiding barns. But when a mare was found alive, trembling and near blind, with deep gouges in her flanks as though fingers, not claws, had dug into her flesh, the whispers grew sharper. A second fracture came soon after. Children, walking home from school one late afternoon, claimed they saw shapes at the edge of the tree line. 5 figures huddled low, swaying as if to a rhythm only they could hear, blackened eyes, wide mouths, crouched forms squatting in unison. The children ran screaming. Their mothers dismissed it as imagination, fright turning shadows into monsters. But when 2 mothers compared their children's stories later, detail for detail, the hair on their necks stood. The third fracture tore the silence wide open. A hunter entered those woods, an outsider from another county, unaware of the unspoken laws. He never came out. Days later, his hound staggered into town, ribs showing, body mangled with scratches. When men gathered with lanterns to follow the dog's trail back, what they found sickened them to the core. The hunter's body was spread across the forest floor, stripped nearly to bone. His gun was missing. His knife snapped in pieces beside him. But his boots, both boots, were placed neatly at the base of a tree. And carved into that same tree were faces. Dozens of faces gouged deep into bark, warped smiles that mirrored the wooden carvings hidden inside the Whitaker house. At last, there were no more arguments in the taverns, no more mutterings of delusion. The Whitakers had not been left behind. They had come forward. The sheriff, his own hands trembling relentlessly since that night in January, pleaded again for restraint. "We take this to St. Louis," he urged. "We cannot carry this ourselves. Let officials, let doctors see. Let the law settle it." But the mayor shook his head, his voice iron yet hollow. "If we speak of this, the world won't see Missouri. They'll see sickness. They'll see monsters. We cover it." Like before, the town split in fury. Farmers demanded protection. Mothers clutched their children harder when dusk fell. Men argued with fists outside the saloon, half screaming to burn the Whitaker house, half begging to pretend none of it was real, and all the while, smoke continued to rise faintly from that blackened chimney in the woods. The crooked house still stood. The rocking chair still creaked on the porch. Agnes Whitaker still swayed back and forth, empty eyes tracking anyone who dared linger too close. The sheriff drank deeper each night, his resolve crumbling under the weight of knowing he had failed twice now, failed to end it, failed to convince them. The blacksmith vanished into his forge, hammering endlessly at meaningless projects. deaf to the world outside, as though pounding metal could drown the memory of snapping jaws. The preacher retreated into fevered sermons of damnation and brimstone. Though only a few anxious souls still came to listen, it was the children. Though who paid first? 2 boys disappeared by summer's edge. Brothers only 9 and 11. They had wandered too close to the tree line while chasing a strayed kite. They did not come back. Their parents screamed for days after. Their bodies never surfaced. Only scraps of cloth were found weeks later, tangled high in a branch deep in the Whitaker woods, far too high for any boy to have climbed. That was the moment the town cracked. Torches were raised. Rifles were loaded. The mayor was shouted down, his pleas for silence drowned in sheer parental rage. A mob gathered at dusk, men thick with desperation and terror, swearing to drag the Whitakers into the open, to finally end what the sheriff and his deputies had failed to when they first entered that cursed house. But the sheriff, pale, shaking, tried to stop them. He stood on the steps, lantern high, begging them with what shred of authority he still held. "You think you'll burn them down? You think fire scares what I saw in there? You march, and you'll find yourselves staring too long into that house. And once you do, you won't come back the same." No one does, yet they refused him, because fear disguised as rage does not yield to warnings. And so, armed with pitchforks, rifles, and trembling hands, the mob turned toward the Whitaker woods. Their torches lit the tree line like jagged stars against the night. For decades afterward, old men would swear the forest itself shuddered as those hundreds of feet crashed into it, pushing deeper and deeper toward the crooked house, and inside that house the Whitakers waited, not hiding, not afraid, waiting. The rocking chair creaked louder that night. The twisted foot of Agnes nudged it steady, in rhythm to the sound of approaching flames, as though she knew exactly what was coming, as though she had rocked through it all before. The mob crashed through the trees with all the force of desperation. Lanterns swung wildly, spilling light over tangled branches and mud, torches flaring bright against the June night. Their shouts cut through the chirping summer air, sharp, frantic vows to rip the Whitaker brood from their lair and burn them alive. Behind the noise, though, was something quieter, something every man in that horde felt but refused to admit. Dread, because no matter how many they were, no matter how loud they shouted, they all carried whispers of what the survivors had seen. The grotesque faces, the twisted children, the hulking patriarch. Most of the mob didn't believe every detail, but they believed just enough to know they weren't walking toward criminals. They were walking toward something else. The crooked house greeted them like an open wound. Its roof sagged. Its boards wore the color of rot. And on the porch, as though time had kept her in one endless vigil, sat Agnes Whitaker, rocking, always rocking. That twisted foot nudging the movement steadily, creak after creak syncing almost rhythmically with the mob's march. Her glassy eyes reflected torchlight, each pass blinking orange in the dark like coals glowing faintly in endless sockets. The crowd hissed and cursed at her. A farmer shouted, "Get inside, witch!" Another hurled a rock. It struck the chair, splintering one side. She did not flinch. She did not shift. She rocked, lips twitching, her whisper low and constant, though no man close enough could say what she mumbled. The mob gathered in the yard, a sea of wavering light pressing in against the edge of the porch. At their front stood the blacksmith, veins bulging at his temple, sweat mixing with soot from his torch. "Bring them out!" he bellowed. "Bring them out, or we'll set this whole place to flame." But the house, as always, answered with silence. The sheriff stood behind the mob, face pale, eyes darting as though calculating how much of this crowd might make it back out alive. His hand shook near his revolver, but it wasn't law he felt himself reaching for, it was survival. "Don't go in," he warned again, his voice carrying only to those nearest. "You don't know what waits." But the roar of the crowd drowned him, and then the door to the Whitaker house groaned, "Not open." Not yet. Just a release of air, as if the boards themselves breathed in response to the mob's cries. The torches flickered. The horses tethered at the tree line bucked in panic, whinnies shrill and spine-cutting. Men tensed. Guns rattled. The blacksmith shouted again, but his words broke when the first figure appeared in the doorway. It was one of the Whitaker children. Not quite child anymore, not quite adult, but some warped thing in between. Its limbs dragged uneasily, its head listing far to one side. It didn't blink against the torchlight. Its mouth hung slack, drool spilling steady. It stepped out mechanically, swaying in time with the creak of Agnes's chair. Another followed it. Then another. 4 children emerged, each grotesque in their own way, swaying in unison, heads cocked at the same bent angle. Their bare feet slapped mud softly as they stood before the mob in the glow of flame. The front ranks recoiled in horror. Several men gagged. Women screamed from behind the torches. One man crossed himself 3 times before stumbling back among the crowd. The blacksmith snarled through his fear. "Shoot 'em!" But before even the first rifle cracked, another sound bloomed deep in the house. Heavy. Slow. Familiar to those who had been brave or cursed enough to hear it before. The patriarch's steps. Low. Scraping. Dragging strides that bent every timber beneath his frame. The very porch seemed to moan in anticipation as he emerged, and when he did, the mob fell silent. He ducked slightly beneath the doorframe, his massive, crooked body filling the entrance like some nightmarish idol. His jaw hung uneven, teeth glinting wet in the torchlight. His arms, long and grotesquely muscled, dangled too far below his knees. His chest rose and fell in sharp jerks, each exhalation a growl heavy enough to vibrate lantern glass in the crowd. And stepping beside him, crawling more than walking, came the stair creature. Its face, engorged and asymmetrical, rode low to the ground, pulling its bulk forward with arms like ropes of bone. It hissed as though the very air tore its throat. Pandemonium rippled through the mob. Some screamed and fled at once, retreating toward the woods. Others lifted rifles, their hands wavering but desperate. A dozen shots fired almost at once, the night exploding with sound. Smoke choked the air. The figures staggered but did not fall. The patriarch groaned louder, a roar more animal than man. The stair creature lunged on its arms, shrieking through saliva. The children shrilled their jagged laughter, throwing themselves forward without hesitation. The mob cracked apart. Torches fell into the weeds. Guns rang uncontrolled, muzzles flashing across faces like lightning. The front ranks dissolved into chaos as the Whitakers swarmed from their porch into the night air. Not fast, not agile, but unstoppable, a tide of deformity and rot spilling outward. The sheriff saw it break as he had known it would. His voice was lost in the noise. He turned, pulling at the men nearest him, screaming words they could not hear. Run. But the mob had already become a slaughter. The Whitakers did not fight like men. They did not fight to win. They fought to devour, to destroy, to drag screaming bodies back toward the gap of that twisted doorway, and the earth of Missouri would drink heavily that night. The screams carried farther than the torch's light. From the tree line, wives and children who had not dared follow could hear them, howls that began as battle cries and dissolved into terror. Gunfire cracked and echoed hollow through the woods, louder, then fainter, then frenzied. And then the cries began to change. No longer human, shriller, jagged. The distinct pitch of laughter, distorted, mismatched, spilling over the wails of dying men. The Whitakers were not fast. They did not need to be. Their grotesque forms shambled, staggered, clawed, but they never tired. And in the yard of that house, panic made the mob weak, scattering men who only an hour earlier had sworn vengeance. The blacksmith was among the first to fall. His rage had burned too hot to flee. He swung his iron hammer with all the strength of his massive arms, shattering the jaw of one child thing, caving it in with a crunch that stunned even the mob. But before he could roar his triumph, the stair creature lunged low out of the smoke. Its clawed hand hooked into his ankle. Its weight dragged him down. He hammered at it again and again, sparks flying as iron struck bone. Yet it would not let go. The last anyone saw of him was his mouth stretched in a scream as the patriarch reached him, bent low with impossible speed, and silenced him in a single crushing blow. The mob fractured more with each death. Some fired wildly, hitting shadows and too often their own. Firearms barked until clicks signaled empty chambers. Men swung rifles like clubs, beating back malformed children who clambered onto their backs. But sheer numbers collapsed in the Whitakers' favor. The preacher on his knees wailed scripture, tears flooding his sunken eyes. His torch spat sparks onto the mud as he shouted at heaven to strike the brood down. But only one figure came to him, the matriarch Agnes, who at some point had risen from her rocking chair and shuffled through the chaos untouched. She stood over him, her cataract veil eyes fixed down, lips forming soundless words. The preacher shrieked and pressed his Bible upward. She smiled, cracked and horrid, and leaned in close enough to whisper something in his ear. Whatever she said twisted him. Witnesses claimed his scream changed pitch then, not in defiance, not in divine fury, but in surrender. The preacher rose without resistance, dropped his Bible into the mud, and walked quietly back into the house alongside two buckling children. His torch smoldered cold behind him. Others watched this in disbelief. A few screamed after him, more simply ran. By midnight the mob was scattered. Some fled into the trees, vanishing into black forest that seemed suddenly endless. Some lay broken near the porch, bodies twitching under the weight of the brood. And some were dragged inside, their arms scraping deep lines into the dirt as their voices begged for mercy, for help, for anything. The creaking door swallowed them. The sheriff survived, though he would never speak of how. Covered in dirt, streaked in the blood of others, he managed to claw his way from the yard by following the ditch line of an old drainage channel. Rifle fire still echoed behind him, some from his own men, some not, and he crawled until the sound dulled in distance. Hours later he stumbled into town, bearing words no one wanted. St. Louis would never be told what happened that night. Not in truth. Missouri would stand untainted for the public eye. But in the private rooms where officials met, that lawless silence was deepened. Reports were sealed. Families of the dead were warned. Hair pact was spoken, not written. The Whitakers do not exist, and so their house stood. Some mornings smoke still curled from its chimney. Some nights hunters swore they heard faint cries twisting with the howl of wolves. And some believed, many believed, that those dragged inside had not all died. Some of them still lived in there, changed, eroded into the bloodline, twisted to join the brood. The sheriff lost himself slowly. Months after, he was found wandering the railroad tracks, muttering Agnes's whisper over and over to himself. No one understood the words. He didn't either, not fully, but he repeated them like scripture until they carried him away, locked in silence. The blacksmith, it was said, was heard only once more, by a farmer passing near the tree line the following winter. He swore he heard hammering, not in the forge back in town, but in the woods, an iron hammer striking in steady rhythm, faint and wrong, echoing not from industry but from something deeper beneath the earth. The town buried its shame. The missing were written off as lost to fire, hunting accidents, runaways. Children were hushed when they asked why neighbors never returned. The name Whitaker became taboo, spoken only as a warning, and in schools, in libraries, in the pages of Missouri's records, the family never existed at all. But blood remembers what ink erases, and Missouri remembered in silence. For decades no one approached the house, not hunters, not surveyors. Its land sat empty, its fences rotted away, until it became one of those places people mention with a shiver, but will never point to on a map. Stories devolved into campfire tales, whispered with nervous laughter. Yet those who had truly seen them carried the truth in secret. And the truth was this: the Whitakers were never destroyed. That night, all the mob managed was to feed them, fresh blood poured into a pit already bottomless. It was the night Missouri forgot on purpose. And yet in the marrow of its soil, the state never forgot at all. By autumn of 1904, Missouri turned its eyes toward glory. The World's Fair in St. Louis dazzled visitors with electric lights, inventions and promises of progress, while brass bands thundered through the boulevards. It was a year meant to showcase the future of America, a year written in bold ink, but not everything was written. In the small township less than a day's ride away, the ground was still soft with blood. In the weeks after the mob's march toward the Whitaker house, no one spoke openly of what had happened. Husbands failed to return, sons disappeared. Mothers stared at empty doorways, clutching coats that would never again be worn. And yet, when townsfolk whispered, the mayor's hand slapped down firm, no talk. Not outside these walls, not ever, it was decided. Officially, nothing happened. The courthouse ledger recorded missing men as lost to accidents or perished in natural misfortune. The blacksmith's wife, who demanded justice, was warned that pressing further would only smear her husband's name. The preacher's parishioners searched for their shepherd, but were told he had suffered a breakdown and been sent elsewhere for treatment. In reality, His Bible lay rotting somewhere near the Whitaker porch, soaked in rain and mud. The silence hardened into law. No paper printed a word of the massacre. No historian marked it down. By the time winter frost crept back into Missouri soil, the tragedy was already written out of existence, yet what cannot be told aloud still festers in the dark. The sheriff, once a man of iron, decayed into nothing. Whenever whiskey loosened his tongue in solitude, he mumbled about rocking sounds echoing through his dreams, the creak of Agnes's chair, endless, steady, mocking. His children found him one night wandering near the train tracks, whispering to shadows, muttering the words Agnes had once rasped into his ears, "No one leaves whole." He died with that sentence on his lips. Leaving his family cursed with his knowledge, the blacksmith's forge went silent. Some claimed at night they still heard the echo of his hammer. Not in town, out in the woods, faint and hollow, an iron striking metal or perhaps bone. Men who heard it swore it followed them home, chasing them through the night until morning's light made the sound vanish. No one ever dared go searching for its source. The preacher never reappeared. His congregation left his name unspoken, ashamed of how he had walked willingly into the Whitakers' house that night. Some said he had been devoured. Others swore he still lived in there, twisted into something that swayed in rhythm with the brood, his once holy voice now reduced to broken groans. Mothers warned their children, "Do not wander to the trees or the preacher will call you in," and the families who lost their sons to the march carried silence like a shroud. A boy asks one night, "Where did Uncle go?" The answer, "Traveling." Another asks, "Why is our neighbor's field empty?" The answer, "Sold off." But between adults, the truth remained unspoken, unspeakable, and their eyes shifted nervously whenever the woods were mentioned. The land itself bore scars. Wagons creaked faster when passing by the tree line, drivers refusing to look left. Hunters learned to reroute paths miles wide. The boldest claimed to have seen distant movements at dusk, shapes hunched and swaying between the trees. Some came back pale, cursing themselves for glancing too long. Others didn't come back at all. Through the 1910s, 1920s, even past the wars, the Whitaker place remained. The town never tore it down, never burned it. Perhaps they feared what flames might release. Instead, they ignored it. They built lives around it, but never through it, never over it. A scar allowed to fester. By the 1930s, the story became hushed legend. Elders who remembered the blood night steeled their lips, while children whispered at campfires, daring each other to go near the porch. A few reckless boys ventured too close and came back swearing they saw Agnes still sat rocking, though by then she should have been long buried. When asked, they could never agree on her face. Some said she was skeletal, others said whole and living. The only detail consistent, that the chair never stopped. The 1950s brought highway construction within 20 miles of that rural town. Road crews asked why so much acreage remained wild, undeveloped. Town officials lied with straight faces. Poor soil, unowned land. No paperwork said otherwise because the courthouse ledgers had already been scrubbed 50 years before. The Whitakers never existed, at least on paper, and yet families kept disappearing when curiosity drove them too close. Railroad workers claimed to see a figure limping along the tracks at night, its oversized jaw glinting in moonlight. A fisherman swore he heard laughter, children's laughter, echoing from the trees while he cast his line. By the 1970s, the place was outright forbidden. When strangers asked, locals answered only with silence or with a change of subject. "You're barking at shadows," they'd say. But their eyes betrayed them. The Whitakers had become a shadow too large, too grotesque to face directly. Easier to erase, easier to let them rot outside of history, but bloodlines do not vanish with paper. What hides in silence does not die. It ferments, and those who knew, or believed, claimed that the Whitakers remained not as phantoms, not as superstition, but as flesh still swaying in that crooked house, waiting. The final irony. Missouri erased them not to protect its people, but to protect its reputation. The World's Fair glowed. Newspapers printed shining headlines. The state celebrated progress. And meanwhile, only a few miles away in the dark woods, a family of ruin and deformity sat in silence, rocking, waiting, living proof that history isn't erased. It is only buried. And if you go searching tonight, If curiosity pulls you to that tree line that men refuse to map, listen closely, you might hear it, the slow creak of a chair rocking steady against the boards. You might glimpse pale eyes glowing faint in the window. And if you look too long, you'll learn why the textbooks never recorded the Whitaker name. The past is not gone. It is simply waiting to be remembered. Have you noticed how every family hides secrets that seem to whisper from the past? Here, we uncover buried stories, family curses, and mysteries many would rather silence. But if you've made it this far, it means you feel that same chilling curiosity that holds you captive. Don't let these voices fade away. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow each new case we bring every week. Join a community that isn't afraid to face the darkest side of history. Get ready, the next secrets are already waiting to be told.